right. So let's talk about what are we going to do with these tools and why are they important? Um, we're first going to, for this in this week, be focusing on strictly goal analysis. And in goal analysis, we have a couple of items that we're going to accomplish. I'm going to introduce you, as I mentioned earlier, to a tool that I used uh, in some of my design initiatives with co-designers, and it really, my purpose behind it was to support writing better performance objectives. So we'll use it on several planes, but it'll also, you'll have a chance to practice it in the team activity 2 this week. Talk about goal analysis. Um, One perspective or definition on it is that procedures applied to an instructional goal to identify the sequence of operations and decisions required to achieve the goal would be classified as goal analysis. So we're trying to determine not only the steps, but the sequence for someone to be um, successful in some performance that you are providing instruction for. If you look at the semester project write-up in the syllabus, and I have it in folio as well, these are sequence numbers, and we will be looking at 2 steps this week in preparing a goal statement. One is to do a goal analysis using my learning goal worksheet. And secondly is you're going to write out a goal statement in narrative form, which would be sections 2.51 and 2.52. Let's talk about establishing instructional goals. First, you need a clear general statement of the intended learner outcomes. So you're going to look at the identified problem that you have uncovered through needs assessment. And it has to be something achievable through instruction. As you recall, we used the Mager-Pike model to determine if it was instructional in nature or not, the need, that is. And you want it acceptable to approving officials. And by that I mean you don't want to commit tons of time and hours and resources to building something and then find out that the person who signs off on it doesn't approve. I've learned the hard way in a corporate environment that you need to get those sign-offs early on in the game. And you also have to identify what resources are available to you, all based on behaviors that are observable and measurable. Things that you might include in an initial goal statement would you want to identify who the learner is and also identify what the learner should be able to do. It also helps identify the context or the environment that they should be able to do this in and what tools or resources do they need to accomplish it. And to use my model that I built into the Learning Goal worksheet will also include evaluation criteria that tell you, how good do they have to do this? What level do they have to achieve to be considered successful? So to further establish and clarify your goals through a goal statement, I'm going to have you, one of the assignments is to write it down, and you're going to define some major steps, and not in this, you don't have to necessarily put those in the statement since they'll be in the Learning Goal worksheet. But you will identify the cognitive domains and the context and criteria. And then you'll get feedback on this, early on, and I'll be serving as kind of that approving official to give you feedback before you progress on. I found it's very effective to, once you've established what the learning needs are, it's a great opportunity to sit down with your stakeholder or your client and explain to them what you've uncovered and get their feedback on, this is what we need, which is time well spent. So let's talk about this tool I've been mentioning, the Learning Goal worksheet. And I've used it in several contexts. Very commonly, I would take a blank one with me to meet with the key stakeholder or client initially and try to establish that learning goal statement, which at the top is, for all means and purposes, your terminal objective. Based on that, you can write a much more clarified goal statement from it. But I would use it kind of as a note-taking tool, and I would encourage my designers to do that. Um, and you can see that I've got some demographic information, the name of the program, the instructor, the date, and that kind of thing. I've also identified at the top what kind of level of measurements we might use. To make reference to Kirkpatrick's model, let's just talk about that just for a moment. Um, Early on, I elect to what level of assessment that we'll be using. This will be discussed later in the chapter, but as you can see, I've offered 4 stages, and they go from top to bottom. In the Actually, in the graphic that you're seeing, that goes from bottom up, and the lowest level, based on Kirkpatrick's model, is reaction. And reaction typically is your training evaluation sheets, or smiley sheets as we used to call them. And then the next level is learning or comprehension. That's where you probably give a test to see what did they learn. Third is application. In application, you are looking at transfer. Did the What level of transfer of the learning occurred in the workplace, which is a pretty important measurement, um, and very seldom is done. Probably the first 2 levels are most commonly done, and in truth, for most instructional implementations, reaction or smiley sheets typically are used most commonly. Um, and I think this transfers over to K-12 on what kind of assessment we're doing. Obviously, we do assessment at the learning level. The very highest level results is, from a corporate perspective, is return on investment. What impact did this change behavior have on this group? That might be a follow-up survey, it might be observations, focus groups, but these are hierarchical in nature. And like as mentioned, progress from reaction to learning or comprehension to behavior or transfer of the skills to results or return on investment. And as you can envision, very few instructional systems are measured at these upper levels, but it really does tell you if it's worth its weight and worth the time. So as you design yours, I've included it on the learning goal worksheet just to designate what level of assessment, and this is a very broad perspective, but what level do you think that your learning event will be evaluated at? Well, if you read the article that had an opportunity to publish in an ASTD publication, um, which is American Society for Training and Development, I used this tool to really give kind of a crutch or a scaffold to my designers to help them write better performance objectives and to ensure alignment of design. And the feedback and response of it, I think, was somewhat successful for most. And basically, I will describe how this plays out. But looking at the bottom of the worksheet, on the left-hand column is where you define the major steps in achieving the terminal objective, which is defined up in the box called learning goal. And that might be several pages that you go into identifying these major steps. Now, I will mention that um, I, in many cases, use this tool to kind of identify from the key stakeholders' perspective what these major steps were. And if I really wanted to get a more empirical or a better look at this, I would go into a task analysis, which we'll talk about later uh, in this module. But task analysis would further define what are the subordinate steps, what are the pre-entry steps, and of course, next week's module focuses entirely on this. But understand that I might draw these very superficially initially just to get started, and these may expand as if I go in and collect archival data, do observations, do the task myself, or do a task analysis, which we'll discuss later. So to continue on the bottom part of the learning goal worksheet, um, under the column conditions, this is conditions for learning. I typically would identify they're going to be, in the field, they're going to be doing classroom learning, computer lab, online, but this pretty well defines the context of the learning where it's going to occur by performance, which as you notice I'm going left to right with this. Then the next stage, which is one of your requirements for this module, is to identify the cognitive domains based on Gagne's learning outcomes that will focus in on, what type of instruction, what kind of learning outcome is coming out of this event. And sometimes they overlap. I typically encourage the designer to have multiple rows so that you have one domain per item, even if it's repetitive. Later in the module, I'll talk a little more about Gagne's learning outcomes. And but finally, in the final column, you'll notice one called criterion, which is what are the restrictions, what tools, will they take a quiz without notes? So this is a place to specify the criterion of learning. Now, there's some meaning behind the madness here with this instrument. You're going to write performance objectives that, in fact, from left to right, have these parts: the performance, the learner, the performance, the condition of learning, what the learning outcome is by action verb, and the criterion. So when we move into writing performance objectives for your module or your learning system, you will use this tool to pretty much construct them, and it helps significantly. So let's talk about Gagne's taxonomy of learning, since that's such a big part of this. He has identified 5 in his research levels of learning, and of which intellectual skills is probably the most complex. We're going to talk about all of these, but there are levels of intellectual skills that entail problem solving, discriminations, concepts, definitions, principles. And these could range from simply making a discrimination between 2 items, like this is a pencil, this is a piece of paper, all the way to ill-structured problem solvings where they have to take their tools and go in and solve them with, it's not a given answer or given strategy, even by an expert. So these are pretty critical, and probably most significant is what you focus your learning events on. The cognitive strategy section throws people a lot of times. It's really not that complex, especially for you K-12 people. It involves metacognition and how people learn to learn, or strategies for problem solving and thinking. So commonly used cognitive strategies might be mnemonics. It might be acronyms to help you remember something, like OAS for Online Assessment System, or it could be mathematical formulas, strategies of that nature. So any strategy that supports metacognition and learning could fall within that category. And there are certainly opportunities where you might use such strategies. From a hierarchical perspective, verbal skills probably at the bottom of the levels described here, but basically it's the regurgitation of facts of knowledge. You have students memorize the capitals of 50 states. For all means and purposes, that's verbal information. And as you get into your subordinate skills, you'll find that your primary focus may be intellectual skills and verbal information, as the book references. Doesn't necessarily have to, because your design can drive that. But you certainly don't want to build an entire learning event on verbal information, because it wouldn't be hitting very higher order learning possibilities. So bear that in mind as you create your design for your lesson. Finally, 2 are pretty self-explanatory to some degree. We know that there are attitudes where people choose to do something, and So it may be that a supporting pre-entry skill, maybe even a subordinate skill to a major step, is that the students adapt or choose to do something. And so you may have an attitudinal based lesson going on, or strategy. And likewise, motor skills is obviously tactile learning where they touch something or do something. So obviously there's opportunities to build those events into your learning design as well. And that should help you understand kind of Gagne's categories, especially when you fill out the Learning Goal worksheet. And in your notes, I've included a few extra slides that kind of respond to the statements I just made about the different learning outcomes. But let me spend a little more time on intellectual skills since there is a hierarchy of information of levels there, and make sure you're clear on each level. As mentioned, it moves up from discriminations to concrete concepts, defined concept, rules, and problem solving. Some examples of discriminations: making different responses to different members of a particular class. In other words, distinguishing yellow finches from other finches would be an example. And if you think about it, that's pretty lower order thinking, or cognitive processing, if you will. So obviously you want to use scaffolding based on Vygotsky's discussion of zones of proximal development and help get them to higher order learning without throwing them into sink or swim. And you would do it through these lower order steps potentially. So one thing I'll look for in your design is that as you go forth, that I see some element of scaffolding, that you kind of build a foundation and worked up to it. The next step is concrete concepts, and that involves responding in a single way to all members of a particular class defined by an observable object property. So that's a fancy way of saying classifying objects as wood, metal, plastic, not simply just discriminating, but you can actually classify, or the learner can classify things based on some categories that are relevant to the instructional goals or learning goals. The next step up on the hierarchy is defined concept, and defined concept is responding in a singular way to all members of a particular defined class. So not just classifying different groups, but classifying groups within a particular defined class. So classifying music as jazz, country, rock, etc. The next step up is rule, and it's relating the relationship between two or more concepts. So let's say that we use some rule such as this one on mass and force. The force required to be exerted equals the mass to be moved multiplied by the acceleration of that mass, or F equals m times a. That would be the use of a rule that relates that relationship between two or more concepts. Problem solving is at the highest end of Gagne's learning outcomes, and it involves combining rules to provide new solutions to unique situations. So, like lining up a golf putt might have that impact. And I just saw my spelling error there on putt, so you can work with me hopefully with that. But that would be taking tools and certain practices and rules. It's really taking all of the intellectual skills and combining them to solve a problem. Now, there are structured problems that we know what the tools are, we know what the outcomes should be, but there's also the concept of ill-structured problems. Ill-structured problems require even higher order thinking, because these are problems where all the information required to achieve the goal, or even the exact nature of the goal, are not clear, even to experts. David Jonasson has done significant research, along with Michael Hannafin, on this topic. And so if you're out searching for articles to look at on ill-structured problem solving, you can find some great stuff by them. Basically, an ill-structured problem means taking a set of tools and going in without a single solution, that it could go in any direction. And let's face it, that's a preparation for critical thinking that's required by our students and by ourselves for future use. So to close out this section, looking at our step in the model, thus far we're talking about goal analysis. In the next module, week 4, or week 5, chapter 4, we're looking at the second half of this instructional analysis approach, which is subordinate skills analysis. And as I mentioned, something that might precede that stage is the use of a task analysis. And task analysis can really go a number of different ways, and I'll talk about it in just a bit. But would be skills that must be learned to achieve a higher order goal. So your major steps to identify your terminal objective, for example, the student will learn to use Excel spreadsheet, and so some major steps would be turn on a computer